Jake had been riding the dusty trails of Arizona Territory for 3 weeks, his water running dangerously low and his horse showing signs of exhaustion. The sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered hat as he searched desperately for any sign of water or shelter. His cattle ranch back in Texas seemed like a distant memory now, lost to drought and debt. All he had left was his horse, his rifle, and a stubborn determination to start fresh somewhere new. Landscape stretched endlessly before him, a maze of red rocks and thorny bushes that seemed to mock his predicament. Jake's throat felt like sandpaper, and his lips were cracked from the relentless heat. He knew he was in Apache territory, but desperation had driven him deeper into these lands than any sensible man would venture. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake spotted something that made his heart leap with hope. In the distance, partially hidden by a cluster of tall saguaro cacti, he could see the faint outline of what appeared to be adobe structures. Smoke rose lazily from somewhere within the settlement, indicating life and possibly water. Spurring his tired horse forward, Jake approached cautiously. He had heard countless stories about Apache raids and knew that showing up uninvited at their camp could mean death. But thirst and desperation had a way of making even the most cautious man take foolish risks. As he drew closer, he could make out details of the small village. There were several traditional wickiups made of brush and hide, along with what looked like more permanent adobe buildings that suggested this was an established settlement rather than a temporary camp. First person to spot him was a young Apache woman gathering water from a natural spring that bubbled up from between the rocks. She froze when she saw the dusty cowboy approaching, her dark eyes wide with alarm. Jake raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm, but the woman let out a sharp cry that immediately brought others running from the village. Within moments, Jake found himself surrounded by Apache warriors, their faces painted for war and their weapons drawn. The leader, a stern-faced man with graying hair and scars that told stories of many battles, stepped forward and spoke in rapid Apache. Jake didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. He was not welcome here. "Please," Jake said, his voice hoarse from thirst. "I just need water. I'll pay for it or work for it. I don't want any trouble." War Chief studied him for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail of the stranger's appearance. Jake's clothes were travel-stained, and his face bore the deep tan of a man who lived his life under the open sky. More importantly, his hands were raised and his weapon remained holstered, showing at least some respect for the dangerous situation he had stumbled into. The chief spoke again, this time in broken English. "You lost, cowboy, this Apache land. You not belong here." "I know," Jake replied, swaying slightly in his saddle from exhaustion. "My ranch failed, lost everything to drought. I'm just trying to get to California, start over. Didn't mean to trespass on your land." Something in Jake's manner seemed to intrigue the chief. Perhaps it was the obvious desperation in his voice, or maybe the fact that he hadn't drawn his weapon despite being outnumbered. The chief gestured to his warriors, and they lowered their weapons slightly, though they remained alert and ready. "You speak truth?" the chief asked. Jake nodded wearily. "Every word. I've got nothing left to lie about." The chief considered this for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "You come, speak with elders, they decide your fate." As Jake was escorted into the village, he noticed 3 young Apache women watching from the entrance of one of the adobe buildings. Unlike the others who regarded him with suspicion or outright hostility, these 3 seemed curious rather than afraid. They were sisters, he would later learn, each possessing a unique skill that was valued by their people. The eldest was called, which meant eternal blossom in their language. She was known throughout the territory for her ability to find water in the most unlikely places, a gift that had saved her people during many dry seasons. Her dark hair was adorned with turquoise beads, and her eyes held a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. Middle sister, whose name meant white dove, was renowned for her skills as a healer. She could identify medicinal plants that others missed and had saved countless lives with her knowledge of ancient remedies. Her gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with the warrior culture that surrounded her, yet she was respected and protected by all. Youngest was, meaning Brown Hills, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to track any person or animal across the harshest terrain. Her small stature and quiet manner often caused strangers to underestimate her, but Apache hunters sought her guidance when pursuing game or following the trail of enemies. As Jake was led past their dwelling, the 3 sisters exchanged glances that spoke of a shared understanding. Each had noticed something different about this dusty cowboy, something that set him apart from the usual run of white men who occasionally stumbled into their territory. Village elders gathered in the central area as word of the stranger's arrival spread. These were men and women who had seen decades of conflict with white settlers, who had watched their traditional way of life slowly eroding as more and more outsiders claimed Apache lands. Their faces were weathered by sun and wind, marked by experiences that had taught them to trust sparingly and forgive never. Jake was made to dismount and stand before this council while his fate was debated in rapid Apache. He understood none of the words, but he could read the tension in their voices and see the skepticism in their eyes. Some clearly favored simply driving him away, while others seemed to advocate for harsher measures. The debate continued as the sun sank lower in the western sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. During this time, Jake noticed that the 3 sisters had positioned themselves where they could observe the proceedings. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in his direction with expressions he couldn't quite read. There was something about their presence that seemed to calm his nerves, even though his situation remained precarious. Finally, the war chief who had first confronted Jake stepped forward to address him directly. "Elders have spoken," he said in his halting English. "You bring bad spirits. White man always bring trouble to Apache people. You must leave before sun dies." Jake's heart sank. Being sent back into the desert without water was essentially a death sentence, and everyone present knew it. His horse was already exhausted, and he doubted they could make it even halfway to the next settlement before collapsing from thirst. "I understand," he said quietly, accepting his fate with as much dignity as he could muster. "I'm grateful you didn't just kill me outright." As he turned toward his horse, preparing for what he believed would be his final journey, a clear voice rang out across the gathering. "Wait." Everyone turned in surprise to see stepping forward from where she had been watching with her sisters. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the crowd as she approached the Council of Elders. It was highly unusual for a young woman to interrupt such proceedings, even one as respected as. "Grandmother," she said, addressing the oldest of the female elders with deep respect. "This man speaks truth. The spirits tell me he brings no evil to our people." Grandmother Elder, a tiny woman whose age was impossible to determine but whose authority was absolute, studied her granddaughter with sharp eyes. "What do the spirits tell you, child?" "They speak of tests and trials," replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "They say this man's path is connected to ours, that his fate and the fate of our people are bound together in ways we do not yet understand." Collective intake of breath greeted this pronouncement. The Apache placed great faith in spiritual visions, and's gift for seeing beyond the physical world was well known. If she claimed the spirits had spoken to her about this stranger, it could not be easily dismissed. Stepped forward to stand beside her sister. "I too have felt something unusual about this man," she said softly. "When I look at him, I see not an enemy but someone who has lost his way and seeks redemption." Before anyone could respond, joined her sisters. Though she was the youngest and typically the quietest of the three, her words carried weight because they were spoken so rarely. "The trail this man follows does not end in our destruction," she said with quiet certainty. "I have read the signs, and they point toward unexpected alliance, not conflict." The council erupted in excited conversation as the three sisters stood together, their united front creating a powerful statement that could not be ignored. Jake watched in amazement as these three young women, whom he had never met before today, risked their own standing in the community to speak on his behalf. Grandmother Elder raised her hand for silence, and the gathering immediately quieted. Her ancient eyes moved from Jake to the three sisters and back again, as if seeing connections that others missed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of wisdom and experience. "Sisters have spoken words that cannot be taken lightly," she said in Apache, her words translated by the war chief for Jake's benefit. "They say the spirits have marked this man as important to our future. If this is true, then we must consider carefully what action to take." Another elder, a man whose face bore the ritual scars of a war leader, stood to address the council. "The sisters are wise, but they are also young. Perhaps their hearts speak louder than their spirits. How can we trust the word of a white man when so many have broken their promises to us?" The debate that followed was intense and prolonged. Jake stood in the center of it all, understanding little of what was being said, but acutely aware that his life hung in the balance. The three sisters remained where they had positioned themselves, their presence a constant reminder of their unprecedented intervention on his behalf. As darkness began to fall over the desert, torches were lit to continue the discussion. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the faces of the gathered Apache, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Jake found himself studying the faces around him, trying to read the mood of the council and gauge his chances of survival. It was then that he noticed something strange. Each of the three sisters wore a distinctive piece of jewelry that seemed to catch and reflect the torchlight in unusual ways. Wore a pendant made from a blue-green stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Had a silver bracelet etched with symbols that appeared to move and shift in the dancing firelight. Wore earrings made from what looked like polished obsidian, but they gleamed with an almost metallic sheen that explanation. As Jake watched, fascinated despite his precarious situation, he began to notice that the three pieces of jewelry seemed to be responding to each other in some way. When moved closer to her sisters, her pendant would glow more brightly. When all three stood together, as they were now, all three items seemed to pulse in unison with a rhythm that reminded Jake of a heartbeat. The elders had noticed this phenomenon as well, and their voices grew quieter as they observed the unusual display. The grandmother elder approached the three sisters, her eyes fixed on their glowing jewelry with an expression of wonder and perhaps a little fear. "The ancient symbols wake," she whispered, her words carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the gathering. "Not since the time of our great-grandmothers have the sacred tokens shown such power." He turned to address the full council, her voice trembling with emotion. "The spirits have indeed spoken through our daughters. The tokens of power choose to reveal themselves now at this moment in the presence of this stranger. This cannot be coincidence." Jake watched in growing amazement as the three sisters stepped forward together, their jewelry now glowing so brightly that it illuminated their faces with an ethereal light. He had no understanding of what was happening, but he could feel the power in the air around them, an energy that seemed to pulse through his very bones. Spoke first, her voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. The water token calls to this man's thirst, not just for drink but for purpose. Followed, her usually gentle voice, now strong and commanding. The healing token recognizes his wounded spirit and offers restoration. Finally, stepped forward, her quiet manner transformed into something almost regal. The tracking token sees his lost path and offers guidance toward his true destiny. Council sat in stunned silence as the implications of what they were witnessing sank in. The three sacred tokens had been passed down through generations of Apache women, each one representing a fundamental aspect of survival in the harsh desert environment. Legend said that when all three tokens awakened simultaneously, it signaled a time of great change and the arrival of someone who would play a crucial role in the tribe's future. The grandmother elder looked at Jake with new eyes, seeing not just a desperate cowboy but potentially something much more significant. "The tokens have chosen," she said finally. "We cannot ignore their wisdom." But even as she spoke these words, Jake could see the conflict in the faces around him. Accepting him would go against generations of hard-learned mistrust of white men. Yet denying the message of the sacred tokens would be equally unthinkable. The war chief stepped forward, his face grim with the weight of decision. If the tokens have truly chosen this man, then he must prove himself worthy of their recognition. Words are easily spoken, but actions reveal truth. He turned to Jake, switching back to English. "You say you have lost everything. You say you seek new beginning. Apache way is to earn what you receive through trial and test. You willing to face Apache test?" Jake looked around at the circle of faces watching him, then at the three sisters whose jewelry continued to glow with otherworldly light. He had no idea what kind of test he might face, but he understood that this was likely his only chance for survival. "I'll face whatever test you set," he said firmly. "I've got nothing left to lose." The war chief nodded grimly. "3 tests," he said. "One for each sister who speaks for you, one for water, one for healing, one for finding path. You must prove worthy of each token's recognition or die in trying." As the council began to disperse, making preparations for the trials that would begin at dawn, Jake found himself alone with the three sisters. They approached him as their jewelry gradually dimmed back to its normal appearance, though he could swear he still felt energy radiating from the sacred tokens. "Why," he asked simply, "why did you speak for me? You don't even know me." Smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the village, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. "The spirits told us your story before you spoke a word," she said. "They showed us a man who has lost much but who carries within himself the seeds of something greater." Stepped closer, her healer's eyes studying his face with professional interest. "Your body is exhausted and your spirit wounded, but both can be restored. The question is whether you have the courage to face what lies ahead." Remained silent, but her dark eyes held a depth of understanding that made Jake feel as though she could see straight through to his soul. When she finally spoke, her words were simple but carried tremendous weight. "Tomorrow you begin a journey that will change not just your life, but the lives of many others. Sleep now, cowboy. You will need all your strength for what comes next." As the three sisters walked away, leaving Jake alone with a guard who had been assigned to watch him through the night, he found himself staring up at the star-filled desert sky. The events of the day seemed impossible, like something from a dream or a story told around a campfire. Yet the memory of those glowing tokens and the conviction in the sisters' voices told him that he had somehow stumbled into something far larger than his own personal quest for survival. The test would begin at dawn, and he had no idea what form it would take. All he knew was that 3 Apache women had risked their own standing in the community to give him this chance, and that mysterious forces seemed to be at work that he couldn't begin to understand. As he finally drifted off to sleep, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of sage and cedar smoke, Jake's last conscious thought was a promise to himself. Whatever these tests demanded of him, he would not fail the trust that had been placed in him by the 3 sisters and their sacred tokens. The desert wind whispered through the village, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come and changes that would reshape the lives of everyone touched by this unexpected meeting of 2 very different worlds. Dawn broke over the Apache village with the suddenness that characterized the desert sunrise. One moment the world was silver-gray shadow, and the next it blazed with golden light that turned the red rocks into glowing embers. Jake awoke to find the 3 sisters standing near him, each carrying items that suggested the nature of the trials he was about to face. Held an empty water gourd and pointed toward the harsh landscape beyond the village. "Your first test begins now," she said, her voice carrying the authority that the sacred token had awakened in her. "You must find water where none appears to exist. You have until the sun reaches its highest point. Return with water or do not return at all." Jake studied the terrain she indicated, his heart sinking as he realized the magnitude of the challenge. The land stretched away from the village in an endless expanse of rock and thorny scrub, broken only by distant mesas that shimmered in the morning heat. He had been riding through similar country for weeks without finding so much as a trickle of moisture. "How am I supposed to find water out there?" he asked. "I've been searching for weeks without success." Stepped forward, her healer's intuition reading the doubt in his voice. "The water token does not respond to those who seek with their eyes alone," she said gently. You must learn to listen with more than your ears, to feel with more than your hands. Handed him a small leather pouch. Seeds, she said simply. Plant them where you find water, they will prove you have succeeded. Jake took the pouch and the empty water gourd, feeling the weight of the village's collective gaze upon him. Men, women, and children had gathered to witness the beginning of his trials, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He understood that he was not just being tested for his own survival, but for the validation of the three sisters' unprecedented intervention on his behalf. The war chief approached, his expression stern but not entirely unsympathetic. Apache children learn to find water from the time they can walk, he said. It is not skill that can be taught in one morning. Either the spirits guide you or they do not. With no other choice, Jake set off into the desert, leaving the safety of the village behind as the sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky. He had roughly 6 hours to accomplish something that Apache children spent years learning to do, and failure would mean death not just for himself, but disgrace for the 3 women who had spoken for him. First hour passed in futile searching as Jake wandered among the rocks and cacti, looking for any sign of moisture. He tried digging in places where the ground looked different, following game trails that might lead to water sources, even tasting rocks and soil in desperate hope, detecting some hint of nearby water. Nothing yielded even the slightest trace of what he sought. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became more intense, Jake found himself thinking about's words. She had spoken of listening and feeling rather than just looking. But what did that mean in practical terms? How could someone hear or feel water that wasn't there? Sitting in the shade of a large boulder to rest and think, Jake noticed a small lizard sunning itself nearby. The creature seemed completely comfortable in the blazing heat, yet it had to get water from somewhere to survive. As he watched, the lizard suddenly darted away with purpose, disappearing behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti. Following on impulse, Jake crawled through the thorny plants and found himself in a small depression surrounded by rocks. The area looked no different from dozens of others he had searched, but there was something about the way the air felt here that caught his attention. It seemed cooler, more humid somehow, though he could see no obvious reason why. Remembering Sid's advice about feeling rather than just looking, Jake pressed his hands against the rocky ground. At first he felt nothing unusual, but as he concentrated and moved his hands slowly across the surface, he began to detect subtle differences in temperature. One area felt noticeably cooler than the surrounding stone. Hope rising in his chest, Jake began to dig with his bare hands, scraping away loose soil and small rocks. The work was under the intense sun, and his hands were soon bloody from the rough stone, but he persisted. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, his fingers encountered something different. The soil was damp. Encouraged, he dug deeper, and soon he could see actual moisture seeping into the hole he had created. It wasn't much, barely enough to wet the bottom of his makeshift well, but it was definitely water. Real, precious water in the middle of what had seemed like completely barren terrain. Jake used his cupped hands to transfer the slowly accumulating water into the gourd, one painful handful at a time. It was slow work, and the water was muddy and warm, but it was more beautiful to him than the finest wine he had ever tasted. When he had collected enough to half-fill the gourd, he carefully planted the seeds had given him around the edges of his small well, marking the spot as proof of his success. Journey back to the village was a triumph march in miniature. Jake's hands were torn and bleeding, his clothes were soaked with sweat, and he was exhausted from the morning's ordeal, but he carried the precious water with the pride of a man who has accomplished the impossible. The sun had not yet reached its highest point, and he had succeeded in the first trial. Village erupted in surprised murmurs when Jake appeared with water sloshing in the gourd. Many of the Apache present had expected him to fail or simply not return at all. Even the war chief looked impressed as he examined the muddy water and confirmed that it was indeed genuine. Stepped forward to accept the gourd, her eyes shining with something that might have been pride or vindication. As she took the container from his bleeding hands, her pendant began to glow softly, confirming that the water token had acknowledged his success. "The spirits guided your hands to the hidden spring," she said formally, but Jake caught a hint of warmth in her voice that suggested personal satisfaction as well. "You have proven worthy of the water token's recognition." There was no time to rest or celebrate. Immediately stepped forward, carrying a bundle of cloth that she unrolled to reveal an assortment of plants, roots, and dried materials that Jake didn't recognize. "The second trial begins now," she announced. "Your spirit carries wounds that run deeper than any injury to your body. You must create a healing medicine that will restore what has been broken within you. But beware, choose wrongly and the medicine will become poison." Jake stared at the array of plant materials, his heart sinking again. He knew nothing about Apache medicine or healing plants. The items before him all looked similar to his untrained eye, dried leaves and roots and bark that could have come from anywhere in the desert. "How am I supposed to know which ones to choose?" he asked. "I've never studied medicine or plants." "The healing token does not respond to book learning," replied, echoing her sister's earlier words about the water trial. "You must look within yourself to identify what needs healing, then trust the spirits to guide your hands to the proper remedy." It seemed even more impossible than finding water had been. At least with the water trial, Jake had been able to use logic and observation to guide his search. But this trial required him to diagnose his own spiritual ailments and then somehow intuitively select the right plants to address them. Kneeling beside the spread of medicinal materials, Jake tried to focus on what it said about looking within himself. What was broken inside him that needed healing? The obvious answer was his sense of failure and loss over losing his ranch, but there seemed to be deeper issues as well. He thought about the years of loneliness, the gradual erosion of hope that had led him to this desperate journey into Apache territory. As he contemplated his inner wounds, Jake found his attention drawn to certain plants in the array before him. There was a root that seemed to call to him, though he couldn't have said why. A collection of dried leaves that felt somehow significant when he touched them. Bark from a tree he didn't recognize that nonetheless seemed familiar in some indefinable way. Trusting the strange impulses he was feeling, Jake began to select materials, following instincts he didn't understand but somehow felt he could rely on. He chose the root that had first attracted his attention, along with several varieties of leaves and bark. To these he added what looked like dried berries and a crystalline substance that might have been salt. Provided him with a stone bowl and showed him how to grind and mix the ingredients using traditional Apache methods. As Jake worked, following her instructions but making his own choices about proportions and combinations, he found himself entering an almost meditative state. His mind seemed to quiet, and he felt more centered than he had in months. The resulting mixture was a coarse powder that smelled strongly of sage, and something else Jake couldn't identify. Instructed him to mix it with water from his hard-won morning discovery and drink the entire preparation. "If you have chosen correctly, the medicine will heal what is broken," she said solemnly. "If you have chosen poorly, it will be the last thing you ever taste." Jake looked at the murky brown liquid in the bowl, knowing that his life once again hung in the balance. The three sisters watched intently, their sacred tokens beginning to glow as they had the night before. The assembled villagers held their breath as Jake raised the bowl to his lips and drank the entire contents without hesitation. The taste was bitter and earthy, with undertones that reminded him of cedar smoke and rainwater. For a moment nothing happened, and Jake wondered if he had failed the test and was about to die from poisoning. Then a warmth began to spread through his body, starting in his stomach and radiating outward until it reached his fingertips and toes. The physical sensations were nothing compared to what happened in his mind and spirit. Years of accumulated bitterness and disappointment seemed to lift away like morning mist. The crushing sense of failure that had driven him from his homeland transformed into a quiet acceptance of the lessons life had taught him. Most surprisingly, the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long was replaced by a growing sense of connection to something larger than himself. Jake felt tears running down his cheeks, but they were tears of relief and release rather than sorrow. Looking around at the Apache faces watching him, he no longer saw strangers or potential enemies, but fellow human beings struggling with their own challenges in a harsh but beautiful world. Bracelet blazed with silver light as she approached to check on him. "The healing token has accepted your choice," she said with obvious satisfaction. "Your spirit has been cleansed and made ready for what lies ahead." Once again, there was no time for rest. As the sun reached its zenith and began its afternoon descent, stepped forward with the materials for the final trial. She carried a bow and a quiver of arrows, along with several items that Jake couldn't immediately identify. "Third trial will test not your ability to find something that exists, but to track something that does not wish to be found," she announced. "In these hills lives a spirit wolf that shows itself only to those it deems worthy. You must track this creature to its den and bring back proof that you have found it. But remember, it is a spirit being. Normal tracking methods will not suffice." Jake accepted the bow and arrows, testing the draw and finding the weapon well-balanced and powerful. But his confidence was shaken by his description of the quarry he was expected to track. A spirit wolf sounded like something from Apache legend rather than a real creature he could hunt using conventional methods. "How do you track a spirit?" he asked. "What kind of sign does such a creature leave?" Obsidian earrings caught the sunlight as she tilted her head thoughtfully. "The tracking token does not follow footprints or scent trails," she said. "It follows intentions and dreams, hopes and fears. You must learn to read the landscape with more than your eyes." War Chief approached, adding his own warning to cryptic instructions. "Many Apache hunters have sought the spirit wolf over the years," he said gravely. "Some have returned empty-handed, others have not returned at all. The creature is not malevolent, but it tests those who would find it in ways that can break a man's spirit or drive him mad." Despite these ominous warnings, Jake set off into the hills with determination born of his earlier successes. The first two trials had taught him to trust instincts he hadn't known he possessed, and he hoped that would serve him in this final test as well. Terrain here was different from the flat desert where he had found water. Rocky hills rose and fell in complex patterns, covered with scrub oak and pine trees that provided welcome shade, but also countless places for a creature to hide. Normal wolf sign would have been difficult enough to follow in such country, but tracking a spirit being seemed impossible. Jake spent the first hour searching for conventional sign, tracks, scat, disturbed vegetation, but found nothing that suggested the presence of any large predator. Remembering Sid's advice about tracking intentions rather than footprints, he tried a different approach. Instead of looking for physical evidence, he began to focus on how the landscape made him feel. Some areas felt neutral, offering neither welcome nor warning. Others made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't define, as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. But occasionally he would find spots that felt different, not threatening, but significant somehow, as though something important had happened there. Following these intangible signs, Jake found himself climbing higher into the hills, leaving the desert floor behind for cooler, pine-scented air. The sun was well into its afternoon descent when he reached a small plateau that overlooked the entire valley where the Apache village nestled among the rocks. Here, Jake felt the strongest sense yet of a presence that was both ancient and watchful. Sitting quietly on a fallen log, he tried to open his mind the way he had during the healing trial, letting go of conventional thinking and allowing intuition to guide him. That was when he saw it. At first, it appeared to be just a shadow moving among the trees at the far edge of the plateau. But shadows didn't move with such purpose or grace, and they certainly didn't pause to look back at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Wolf was larger than any natural animal Jake had ever seen, with fur that seemed to shift color between silver and black depending on how the light struck it. Its eyes were definitely not those of an ordinary predator. They held an intelligence and awareness that was almost human. For a long moment, man and wolf regarded each other across the small clearing. Jake felt no fear, despite the creature's obvious power. Instead, he experienced a profound sense of recognition, as though he was meeting an old friend after a long separation. Wolf turned and padded silently into the trees, but not before looking back one more time in what Jake interpreted as an invitation to follow. Rising carefully from his seat, Jake tracked the creature deeper into the forest, no longer needing to rely on conventional sign. He could feel the wolf's presence ahead of him, guiding him towards something significant. The trail led to a hidden cave nestled among the rocks near the summit of the highest hill. The wolf sat at the entrance, watching as Jake approached. As he drew near, the creature's form seemed to become less solid, more translucent, confirming its spiritual nature. Inside the cave, Jake found what he had been sent to retrieve. Lying on a natural stone ledge were 3 items that glowed with the same inner light he had seen in the sisters' sacred tokens. A blue stone similar to pendant, a silver band like bracelet, and black stone earrings identical to those worn by. These were different somehow, older, more powerful, radiating an energy that made the air around them hum with potential. As Jake reached for them, the spirit wolf padded into the cave and touched each item with its nose, as though giving permission for their removal. Understanding flooded through Jake's mind as he gathered the sacred objects. These were not just proof of his successful tracking. They were the original tokens from which the sisters' jewelry had been generations ago. Finding them meant more than just passing the final trial. It meant he had been chosen as guardian of some of the most sacred relics in Apache culture. The spirit wolf watched as Jake carefully wrapped the tokens in cloth and prepared to return to the village. As he turned to leave, the creature spoke, not with words but directly into his mind. "You have proven yourself worthy, cowboy. But the true test lies not in what you have accomplished, but in what you will choose to do with the power that has been placed in your hands." Journey back to the village passed in a blur of anticipation and growing understanding. Jake finally grasped why the 3 sisters had risked so much to speak for him, why their own tokens had responded so powerfully to his presence. Somehow, through means he couldn't begin to understand, he had been chosen to play a role in preserving and protecting the sacred traditions that were the heart of Apache culture. Sun was setting as Jake descended the hills and approached the village, the wrapped tokens secured carefully in his pack. He could see the entire population gathered in the central area, waiting for his return. Torches had been lit against the gathering darkness, and the flickering flames created an atmosphere of expectancy that charged the air with tension. As he walked into the circle of light, Jake saw the 3 sisters standing together near the Council of Elders. Their jewelry was glowing again, but more softly now, as though responding to the proximity of the ancient tokens he carried. The war chief stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of the moment. "You have returned," he said simply. "Did you find what you were sent to seek?" In response, Jake unwrapped the 3 ancient tokens and held them up for all to see. The assembled Apache gasped in amazement as the artifacts blazed with light that illuminated the entire gathering. Many fell to their knees in reverence, while others whispered prayers in their native tongue. The grandmother elder approached on trembling legs, her ancient eyes fixed on the glowing relics. "The original tokens," she breathed. "Lost for 3 generations, the legends said they would return when our people faced their greatest need." He looked at Jake with new respect and something approaching awe. "You have done more than pass our trials, cowboy. You have returned to us treasures beyond price, artifacts that connect us to our deepest traditions and most sacred beliefs." Even as the village celebrated this miraculous return, Jake sensed that his trials were far from over. The spirit wolf's words echoed in his mind, warning that the real test would be what he chose to do with the power he had been given. As the 3 sisters approached to reclaim their ancestral birthright, Jake made a decision that would change everything. Moment hung suspended in time as Jake held the 3 ancient tokens, their otherworldly light painting every face in the gathered crowd with an ethereal glow. The sisters approached slowly, their own jewelry responding to the proximity of the original artifacts with increasing brilliance. The entire Apache community watched in reverent silence, understanding they were witnessing the return of treasures thought lost forever. but as reached out to accept the water token, Jake pulled his hands back, clutching the sacred artifacts to his chest. The gesture sent a shock through the assembled crowd, and several warriors immediately stepped forward with hands on their weapons. "What are you doing?" the war chief demanded, his voice dangerous with suspicion. "Those tokens belong to our people. You were sent to retrieve them, not steal them." Jake looked around at the circle of increasingly hostile faces, seeing his hard-won acceptance beginning to crumble. But the spirit wolf's warning echoed in his mind, and he knew that simply returning the tokens without understanding their full significance would be a mistake that could have devastating consequences. "I'm not trying to steal them," Jake said firmly, though his voice carried the strain of the position he had put himself in. "But before I return them, there's something you all need to understand. Something the spirit wolf showed me about why these tokens were hidden away in the first place." The grandmother elder raised her hand for silence before the war chief could respond. Her ancient eyes studied Jake's face with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Speak," she said simply. "Tell us what the spirit guardian revealed to you." Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either vindicate his decision or likely get him killed. "The tokens weren't just hidden, they were protected. The spirit wolf showed me visions of what happened 3 generations ago when your people last possessed all 3 original artifacts." He gestured toward the sisters, whose jewelry continued to pulse with sympathetic light. "Back then, your ancestors faced a crisis. White settlers were pushing deeper into Apache territory, and there were those among your people who wanted to use the tokens' power to drive them out completely. But the tokens don't work that way. They're not weapons of war." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd as Jake continued. "The tokens represent the 3 pillars of survival: finding sustenance, healing what is broken, and navigating the path forward. When they were used for purposes of vengeance and destruction instead of their true calling, they turned against their bearers. The resulting catastrophe nearly destroyed your entire people." The war chief scoffed at this explanation. "You speak of events from before your birth, white man. How can you know what happened in our history?" Jake's hands tightened on the tokens as their light seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Because the spirit wolf is the guardian of memory as well as the artifacts. It showed me everything. The drought that lasted 7 years, the sickness that killed half your people, the confusion that led war parties to attack each other instead of their enemies. All because the tokens were perverted from their true purpose." Shocked silence greeted this revelation. Several of the older Apache exchanged meaningful glances, their faces reflecting recognition of events that had been passed down through oral tradition but never fully understood. Grandmother Elder stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The time of sorrows," she said, using the Apache name for that terrible period. "When the earth turned against us and brother fought brother, you speak of things that are not written anywhere, things known only to our most sacred keepers of memory." "Spirit Wolf showed me how your wise ancestors finally ended the curse," Jake continued, encouraged by her response. "They separated the tokens, hiding the originals where only one chosen by the spirits could find them, while creating lesser copies to maintain the traditions without the devastating power. It was the only way to break the cycle of destruction." Stepped forward, her healer's intuition recognizing truth in Jake's words. "That's why our tokens have never shown such power before," she said wonderingly. "We carry echoes of the originals, enough to maintain our gifts but not enough to corrupt them." "But if that's true," said slowly, "then bringing the originals back together could trigger the same catastrophe that nearly destroyed our ancestors." Jake nodded gravely. "That's exactly what the spirit wolf showed me. These tokens aren't meant to be reunited unless your people face an existential threat that requires their full power. And even then, they must be wielded by those who understand their true nature and can resist the temptation to use them for purposes they weren't designed for." The war chief's hand moved away from his weapon as the implications of Jake's words sank in. "You are saying we should not reclaim our sacred heritage." "I'm saying you need to understand what you're reclaiming," Jake replied carefully. "The spirit wolf didn't guide me to these tokens just so I could return them and walk away. It wants me to help your people learn to use them properly, to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past." Who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "The tracking token showed me something similar during our trials," she said quietly. "I saw visions of a great confusion coming, a time when our people would need to choose between 2 paths. I thought it meant choosing between the old ways and the white man's ways, but perhaps it means something else entirely." Her words triggered a memory in Jake's mind, another vision the spirit wolf had shared with him in the cave. "There's more," he said reluctantly. "The spirit guardian showed me why it chose to reveal the tokens now to me specifically. It's not just about your people. There's a threat coming that will affect everyone in this territory, Apache and white settlers alike." The grandmother elder leaned heavily on her walking stick, suddenly looking every one of her many years. "Tell us," she commanded. Jake closed his eyes, allowing the vision to flow through him again. "I saw soldiers coming from the east, more than have ever been sent to this territory before. They carry orders to end the Apache resistance permanently, to drive your people onto reservations or destroy them entirely. But that's not the worst of it." He opened his eyes and looked directly at the war chief. "They're being led by a man who has made a deal with corrupt officials to seize Apache lands for mining. They don't just want to defeat your warriors, they want to enslave your survivors to work the mines they plan to dig on your sacred sites. The crowd erupted in angry voices as this news sank in. Several young warriors immediately began calling for war, demanding that they strike first before this threat could materialize. But the Elder Council remained thoughtfully silent, understanding that conventional warfare against such overwhelming numbers would be suicide. Spirit Wolf showed me a different path, Jake continued, raising his voice to be heard over the angry discussions. The tokens, used properly, could provide protection not through violence but through unity. The water token could ensure survival during siege, the healing token could protect against the diseases the soldiers will bring, and the tracking token could guide your people to safety when conventional warfare fails. Looked at the original water token glowing in Jake's hand, then at her own lesser pendant. You're suggesting we use the artifact's power defensively rather than offensively. More than that, Jake said. I'm suggesting something that has never been tried before, sharing that defensive power with others who face the same threat. The controversial nature of this suggestion sent another shock through the assembly. Apache traditions had always emphasized the exclusive nature of their sacred powers, never sharing them with outsiders. The grandmother elder surprised everyone by nodding thoughtfully. The spirit guardian chose a white man to retrieve the tokens, she mused. Perhaps this is meant to show us that survival in the coming age will require new forms of cooperation. War Chief struggled with the implications of this suggestion. You ask us to trust our most sacred treasures to outsiders who have shown us nothing but betrayal and broken promises. I'm asking you to trust them to people who understand that their own survival depends on yours, Jake corrected. The corrupt officials planning to seize your lands won't stop with Apache territory. Every small rancher, every honest settler, every person who can't defend themselves against this kind of organized greed will be next. He gestured toward the tokens in his hands. These artifacts represent more than just Apache survival. They represent a way of living that honors the land, heals rather than destroys, and finds sustainable paths forward. That wisdom isn't just Apache wisdom, it's human wisdom that the whole territory needs. Stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the healing token. You're proposing to teach our ways to outsiders. I'm proposing to teach them to people who are willing to learn and to protect those teachings, Jake clarified. Not everyone will be worthy, just as not every Apache has been deemed worthy to carry these tokens. But those who prove themselves through trials similar to what I face today, they could be trusted with lesser portions of the power, enough to help defend against the coming threat. Debate that followed was intense and prolonged, with voices raised in both support and opposition to Jake's unprecedented proposal. Some argued that sharing sacred Apache knowledge with outsiders would dilute and ultimately destroy their traditions. Others pointed out that maintaining those traditions would be impossible if their people were enslaved or eliminated entirely. As the discussion continued, Jake noticed that the three sisters had moved to stand together, their jewelry and the original tokens in his hands all pulsing in synchronized rhythm. The pattern of light seemed to suggest some form of communication between the artifacts, as though they were conferring about the proposals being debated. Suddenly gasped and staggered backward, her hand pressed to her pendant. The water token is showing me visions, she said in amazement. I can see the drought coming, not just lack of rain, but poisoned water sources as the mining operations contaminate the underground springs. Experienced a similar reaction moments later. The healing token shows disease spreading from the overcrowded conditions where they plan to force our people to live. But it also shows remedies, combinations of Apache and white man's medicine that could save many lives. The last to be affected, but her vision seemed the most comprehensive. The tracking token shows multiple possible futures, she said slowly. In most of them, our people are scattered or destroyed, but there's one path where we survive and prosper, where our wisdom spreads and helps heal the entire territory. That path requires the cooperation this cowboy describes. Sacred tokens themselves had spoken through their chosen bearers, and even the most traditional members of the council could not ignore such clear guidance. But there remained the question of how such an unprecedented alliance could be implemented. The grandmother elder rose to address the assembly, her voice carrying the weight of ultimate authority. The spirits have spoken clearly. We must find a way to honor both our traditions and the new path they have revealed. But such a momentous change cannot be decided in one night. He turned to Jake, studying him with eyes that seemed to see possibilities invisible to others. You who have proven yourself worthy of the token's recognition, are you willing to serve as a bridge between our peoples, to help select and train those outsiders who might be trusted with portions of our sacred knowledge? Jake felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything in his life had led to this moment, the loss of his ranch that had driven him into Apache territory, the desperate search for water that had taught him to trust spiritual guidance, even the healing of his own inner wounds that had prepared him to help others. I'm willing, he said simply, but I can't do it alone. This kind of alliance will require Apache leaders who can work with outsiders without betraying their own people's interests. The three sisters exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally spoke for all three. We accept the responsibility, she said formally. The tokens chose us as their bearers, and now they guide us toward this new path. We will work with you to build the bridges our peoples need. The war chief raised an immediate objection. "My daughters, you speak of great risks and greater responsibilities. Are you prepared for the dangers you will face moving between two worlds that have been enemies?" "We are prepared, father," replied, using a term of respect rather than indicating actual kinship. "The healing token has shown me that many white settlers carry spiritual wounds similar to those we found in this cowboy. They can be healed and guided toward better understanding." Nodded agreement. "The tracking token reveals that there are already white people in this territory who respect the land and could learn to live in harmony with our ways. We must find them before the corrupt forces arrive to destroy everything." Debate continued deep into the night, but gradually a consensus emerged. A small group of Apache would work with Jake to identify and train trustworthy outsiders in modified versions of their survival techniques. These new allies would help defend against the coming threat while learning to respect and protect Apache traditions. It was an unprecedented experiment in cooperation between two cultures that had been enemies for generations. Many details remained to be worked out, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and betrayals along the way. But as dawn approached and the tokens continued to glow with approving light, it became clear that a new chapter was beginning for both peoples. Jake finally returned the original tokens to the three sisters, watching as they replaced their lesser artifacts with the full power of their ancestral heritage. The moment of transfer created a blaze of light that was visible for miles across the desert, announcing to anyone with the wisdom to interpret such signs that a new age had begun. As the sun rose over the Apache village, Jake found himself no longer a desperate refugee fleeing failure, but a man with purpose and a community that had accepted him as family. The trials had tested more than his ability to find water, create medicine, and track elusive prey. They had revealed his capacity to bridge differences, heal wounds, and find new paths forward when old ones led only to destruction. Three sisters stood beside him as the village began its daily activities, their sacred tokens now glowing with steady light that spoke of power being used for its intended purposes. Carried the wisdom of the waterways, bore the knowledge of healing both body and spirit, and held the ability to track the paths that led to safety and prosperity. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, teaching outsiders the Apache ways of survival, building alliances between former enemies, and preparing for the threats that the spirit world had revealed. It would not be easy, and there would be those on both sides who opposed such radical changes to traditional ways of thinking. But as Jake looked out over the desert that had almost been his grave and was now his home, he knew that the spirit wolf had chosen well. The tokens had found their proper guardians, and those guardians had found each other just in time to face whatever storms lay ahead. Cowboy's desperate cry of "Fine, I'll claim them," had led him to claim not just the sacred tokens, but a destiny he could never have imagined. The three Apache sisters had become his lifeline indeed, not just saving his life, but giving it a meaning and purpose that would resonate across the territory and down through the generations. As the first of their potential allies began arriving at the village over the following days, honest ranchers, displaced families, and others who had heard strange tales of lights in the desert and unprecedented cooperation between Apache and whites, Jake knew that his real journey was just beginning. Trials had prepared him for this moment, but the true test would be whether he and his new Apache family could forge a lasting peace in a land where conflict had reigned for so long. The tokens pulsed with steady confidence, suggesting that the spirits believed success was possible. Only time would tell if their faith was justified,